They say, if you forgot it twice, you shouldn't be happy. Go to something else.
Okay, gewaltig. Zakt de hele Gemara. Shloisha lekuchos. I'm at the bottom of Mem Aleph on the base. Three lekuchos. So that means this property originally belonged to Reuven, and he sold it to Shimon, or the claim is that he sold it to Shimon. Shimon, after 1 year of living there without any error from Reuven, sold it to Levi. After another year, after Shimon living there for a year, he then turned it around and sold it to Levi. And then Levi turned around and sold it to Yehuda. So now you have Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, each was machzik in this karka for 1 year, and in all these 3 years, Reuven didn't sell wood. Zok to Gemara mitztarfen. That's considered a chazak of 3 years, and even if neither of these 3 buyers have a star, Reuven can no longer say that it was his property. Omarav, Zok Rav, this only works if v'kulam b'shtar. This only works if when Shimon sold it to Levi, he sold it with a star. And when Levi sold it to Yehuda, he also sold it with a star. Because the fact that he sold it with a star, that would have definitely got to the ear of Reuven, and then it would have been incumbent on him to be moichet. I'm sorry? Could be, yeah. The Gemara, remember, the Sava Rav, star is like Kala, so it must be that Rav holds that only if Shimon and Levi sold it with a star, then there would have been a coil. That would have caused a need for Reuven to be ma'ayer, because if you hear people selling your property, you obviously know someone's trying to be machzik. And ve'edim less lukala. Rava said if the second and third mechira from Shimon to Levi, from Levi to Yehuda was done with edim, then we're going to say that Reuven didn't know about it. Reuven didn't hear about it, and therefore Reuven didn't have to be moichet. Rather, Reuven just sees 3 individuals living in it. That's not a chazaka if 3 different people live in it in 3 different years. To the contrary, that doesn't show much of an ownership because nobody had the guts to stay there longer than a year. It's only if there's a star which there would be a problem. But straight to Gemara, if you do something with Edom, it does generate a code. The Omarav, Hamoicher Soda Be'edim, Goyven Minachasim Mishuvodim. So what happens is Reuven sells, he has many fields. He sells one of his fields with Edom to Shimon. The halacha is, even though there's no star on this Mecca, there were only Edom, should that field be taken away from Shimon because he might have some choiv, so some malva comes and takes it away, this buyer, Shimon, can seize other properties that Reuven had at the time that he sold this property to Shimon. Meaning if Reuven sold another property to Levi and another property to Yehuda, after he sold his first property to Shimon, Shimon can go take it away from the Lekuchos. How could you possibly make the future Lekuchos vulnerable to Shimon seizing a property from them? How in the world were they supposed to know that Shimon ever bought a property from Reuven? It must be that they do hear about it. Why? Because Edom will also get it around. If someone sells by Edom, it will be known. So Zok Gemara, yes, by Edom they are known, but not as much as a star. Therefore, Hasam Lekuchisin, after Reuven sold his property to Shimon, he made other sales to Levi and to Yehuda. Well, you know what? They should have done a title search. They should have asked around, and they would have heard that Reuven had sold another property with Edom prior to their purchase. So therefore, it's Iyunuda of Sidin of Shayu. In other words, if you sell by Edom, it'll make enough noise that someone looking for trouble will find out about. So these Lekuchos, had they done their due diligence, they would have found out about. Masha'enkein, in our case, there's no Lekeach doing due diligence. The question is, does the homeowner, does the original owner, does Reuven need to know that there was a sale done? no one does a title search on their own property every year. So therefore, if there was a sale with Adam, the Baal would never have known about it. And therefore, Reuben has no need to be moicha. He just sees different people being machzik in his property for a year. But if it was sold with a star, for sure the owner would have heard about it, and therefore there's a continuance, there's continuity from these three buyers, and therefore it's incumbent on Reuven to have made a machzik. Fact to Gemara, Umi Amar Rafa. Did Rav say this? What specifically is the Gemara challenging? The mechiras karka be'achrayis be'edim beloy shtar goyva halokeach kishiyitrafu amimenu minachos mishabad. Do we actually say that if you buy a property and there's no shtar, there's only edim, you still have a right to collect from future lukuchos? Is that so? Now, it's just interesting to note, we know there's a rule when you sell a karka, there's something called achrayis tos sofer. It's assumed that I'm selling it with achrayis. It's assumed that when I'm selling a property to somebody else, that I'm giving him a guarantee that if it gets taken away from him, I'm liable to pay him back. Right? That's called achrayis tos sofer. But the lashon of this statement is achrayis tos sofer, meaning it's something that applies to a milva b'shtar, not necessarily to a milva alpeh. If you look at the Rashbam, at the bottom of the Amud Beis, the Rashbam says, the kibul olav achrayusa. It's mashma from the Rashbam that by default, yes, on a sale with a shtar, achrayis tos sofer, but on a sale with edim, you don't say achrayis tos sofer. It happens to be, in this case, he was makabel achrayis, but not necessarily would that be the default. Rabbi Yoyon argues, and he holds by default when you sell a property, even if it's with edim, by default there would be achrayis. So you would say achrayis tos sofer, even though there's no sofer involved with you. So, Frank the Gemara, is it true that the buyer, in fact, the first buyer has a right to collect from future buyers? Is that in fact the case? Well, it's not we learned in the Mishnah. If you lend somebody money with a shtar, then the halacha is the malva can be goyim in a. If the loiva defaults, any property that the loiva sold after he borrowed this money is vulnerable to the malva can collect from it. As the Rashbam says, the stam shtar lachrayis nichtav. When the shtar is written, there's achrayis. Afilu loy nichtav, even if achrayis was not written in to the shtar, kaimalon achrayis toy sofer uchamisha nichtav done. Okay, but al yidei edim, if the milva was only done through edim, goyvim minachasa b'nechayim. So let's see the Rashbam weiter. Minachasa mishabada means milakuhos. The malva can collect and seize a property that the loiva sold after this loan occurred. The malva only has a right to collect from lekuchos if the loiva doesn't have anything left to take from. But of course, the purchaser of a property from a loiva is not in the first position to collect from; he's in the second position, and you could only collect from him if you were unable to collect from the loiva himself. But al yidei edim claim of a loishtar, then the malva can only collect minachasim b'nei uchagoyin shemodish leipori, and then you can only collect if the loiva agreed, he admitted that he didn't pay it. The kaimalon, we just looked this yesterday, the day before. The kaimalon hamilva kaveri be'edim. If you lend money and there's no shtar, there's only edim, ein tzarich lepori be'edim. The loiva can pay back without edim, and then the loiva has a right to claim. Yes, you can prove that I borrowed money, but I claim that I paid back, and I don't have to have edim that prove that I pay back. But you cannot collect from mishubadim. The edim below shtar less blue collar. Edim without a shtar does not create a koil at all. And therefore, you don't say the lekucha should have known about it. Since it was done with edim, the lekuchas would never have heard about it, and therefore they shouldn't be vulnerable. Their purchasers shouldn't be vulnerable to being seized. And therefore, the kosher Rav, because Rav just told us that hamoicher sada be'edim goyim in a chasam mishubam. V'chi teman, if you're going to want to suggest that Rav Tana hu upolik, Rav is a Tana, and he has a right to argue on the Mishnah. The Rav Shmuel Damar Tavayu, Rav and Shmuel said, so Rav himself said, Milva al peh eine goyve loy min hayorshim v'loy min halakuchos. So you see, Rav himself said that if it was a milva al peh, meaning there was Edom but no star, the Malva wouldn't be able to mum from the Lakuchos, because there's no way the Lakuchos could have known about this Milva when the Lakuchos purchased the property. Zog to Gemara, Milvas Vini Karamis. The halacha that we quoted from Rav and Ahmed Beis was if someone sells something, Be'edim, any later purchaser will be able to find out that before I bought this property from Reuven, somebody else bought a different property from Reuven. That I would find out. But I would not necessarily find out that the person, Reuben, who I bought my property from, had borrowed money before that with Edom. So Milva Zvini Karamis, it's the contrary. Milva Kika Yosef Vitzinika Yosef. When Reuben borrowed money, it wasn't with great fanfare. He tried to keep it quiet. Nobody wants to advertise when he's borrowing money. So therefore, Milva Be'edim, the word would not get out. If people hear that Reuben's borrowing money, people are going to offer him less for his purchases because people are going to see Reuben is tight for cash. But Zvini, when Reuben is selling something, when you buy land, it's with great fanfare. So it should be known. Why? Because he's advertising it for sale. Why? He wants to attract the most buyers. So therefore, there's a very big difference between if you sell a property with Edom, where we would assume people will be able to find out about it, and therefore future Lekuchais are accepting upon themselves that liability, that they might lose their karka, they might be seized by an earlier purchaser, but they will not find out about a loan that was done with Edom without a star, and therefore they can't possibly accept that vulnerability. Zok Teiliger it's because Shibuda lav daraisa, umiu lekaim al hachi al mefarish shosam hilchas a goy from the yarshim uloy. Rishvam tells us we actually hold that a milva al peh is goyva from the yarshim. Yazav in this b'shina, a person borrowing money does it quiet. Umavaka shaloi mefarish shom. He doesn't want the word to get out. Kedei Jimyove lives per karka. If he's going to sell a property, why? Because he's liquidating it, because he needs the money to pay back. So people shouldn't know that the reason why he's selling is because he's under pressure. And therefore, they're not going to give him a lot of money because they know he's desperate. What could the Lekuchos have done? They would have never found out that there was an outstanding loan. The mandezovin, that someone who's buying property or selling property, it's he's going to advertise. People are going to know about it. Therefore, any later Lekuchos buying other properties from him should have known, if they would have looked into it, that he had sold a different property prior to the one that they bought. Okay, beautiful. Now, on the issue of Rav, Tanahu, Poland, we always were brought up to assume that there's a totem pole, there's a pecking order. Thank you so much. And that is an Amoira cannot argue on the Tana, and a Rishon or a Goyin can't argue on an Amoira, and a Rishon can't argue on a Goyin, and an Achron cannot argue on a Rishon. That is the classic understanding as to how we understand things, but it's not so partial that way. The Rambam writes that in fact they actually could argue on one another. And Rav Tanahu Polag is merely the minik. They accepted upon themselves. After the period of Tanoim closed, really technically the Maram could have argued, but they accepted it upon themselves to no longer argue on earlier generations, on Tanoim, because they conceded that they didn't have the same wisdom. There was a noticeable drop in wisdom at the time of the closing of the Mishnayos, when the Amoraim got into business, and therefore they accepted not to. But Me'ikar Adin, that you actually would be able to argue. And that's how there's a lot of Torah about it, but that's how the Olam learns the Rambam. In fact, that technically everything is fair game. However, that's how they used to fierce it. Thank you. And that explains why sometimes you find the Gemara asks a kasha from a Mishnah or a Brisa on a Moira, and the Moira answers, "Hi Mishnah lav maslisanu." Sometimes that's an answer. What type of answer is that? What do you mean it's not a Mishnah? It means I don't have to hold it at Mishnah. So sometimes when they could argue, they have the ability to argue, they just decided that they would. Tony Rabbanan, what would happen in a different way? The opposite happened. Achla ha'av shana, the purchaser bought a property. So let's say Reuven bought a property from Shimon, and he was in the property for a year. And then he died. And then the son yarshid it, and Shtayim, the son, ate it the next 2 years. So can you say that that's a chazak of 3 years? Or since it's not the same person using the karka, it's not a good chazak. Or on the other way, the father lived in this property for 2 years, ben shana, and the son was only there for a year. Or even more fragmented, av shana, ben shana, and after the son lived in the property for a year, he sold it, shana, harezu chazaka, that would be a good chazak. So let's have a look at the Rashbam. Achla ha'av shana umeis, v'achla b'nai acharav shtayim, v'loi micha hama'ar. During these 2 years, I think there's 3 years, the owner of the property, Reuben, never said a word. Harezu chazaka, that would be a good chazaka. Shemitztarfin l'shaloi shana. We combine all these years into one 3-year chazaka. Why? The Yorish Kairadavuhu, the Yorish, the Ben is living there based on his father's acquisition. The Ma'ar cannot say, you know why I wasn't moichet to the son? No one was there for 3 years. I had no need to be moichet. Rather, the son is considered the continuation of the father. What about Lekech Shana? So it's more fragmented. It's 3 different situations of a year. Once again, it has to be Bishtar, as we are saying. Otherwise, there's not enough of a koil. So either way, it would be a good chazak. So let's look back at the Gemara. Remember, are you telling me the Lekech is Lekala? That by the Lekech there's a koil? As the Rashbam took out, the Lekech miyoyrei is Lekala. We're talking about the son, after living in this property for a year, had sold it. Is there going to be a koil there as well that also makes it incumbent on the owner, original owner, to make an error or a mini? We have a brisa that seems to contradict this. The brisa says, Achla b'fnei ha'avshtam. So now we're flipping the case around. The owner, the original owner of the property, sold it, and the lekeach used it for a year, and then the father died. And he continued to hold this property after the father died, and now this son had yashin the property, and this machzik is still there. Or shtayim b'fnei av. I'm sorry, b'fnei av shana b'fnei ben shtayim, or b'fnei av shtayim b'fnei ben shana, or b'fnei av shana u'b'fnei ben shana u'b'fnei lekeach shana. Harezu chazaka, that would still be a chazaka. Break the Gemara. V'sol kedaitek lekech is lekala. If we hold that when someone sells something, it creates a coil.
Father was the original owner.
Correct. Because the son is claiming my father never sold it to you, and you don't have a star. So after 3 years, the lekech who produces the star that he bought it a year ago is going to go to this guy and say, "What are you doing on this field that I bought from the son who yarded of the father?" And I have a star, and I have a and the lekech, I have a star, and I bought it from these guys. Where's your star? You claim you bought it from the father? Show me your star. And he says, what do you mean? I bought it 3 years ago. Nobody ever complained, so I don't have my star anymore, right? We learned earlier that if you own a property and someone's being machzik in it and you sell it, you don't have to be ma'ar. The greatest error is that you're actually making a move and you're selling it. So here, the son sold it after 2 years of chazaka. Why wouldn't that bust up the chazaka? Let's see what the Rashbam says. Remember the lekech miyosh is lekala urimini. We didn't ask this kasha from Rav later. The Rav belekech melekech mari. Rav was talking about a case of you're buying it from the person who bought it. Here you're buying it from somebody who yarshed it. Hilchach alim letvei lemifrach l'maydidam. Is lekala lahayaloi lema'arer limchois. Mishum lemicha have a chazaka. Achla hamachzik b'fnei av. Shahoysa shaloi shana sha'omer shalocha b'nav. So the first year he claims he bought it. This buyer claims he bought it from the father. So after he bought it from the father still survives another year. Then the father died, and the buyer who bought it from the father is still living in that field. But now, had it not been sold, it would have belonged to the ben. And the lekeich who bought it from the son has a star. The other fellow who's being masik does not have a star anymore, and that's the whole discussion there. Does he have a chazaka? Zok to Bryce. The one who bought it from the son cannot go to the masik and say, you don't have a chazaka, I have a star, pack your bags and leave. Why? Because the machzik can claim, star hoyali bina'av. I bought this property 3 years ago, not from the person who sold it to you, from his father. I already bought it 3 years ago. When this harti boy b'shmirosoi shaloshonim, and I meticulously guarded my star for 3 full years. Now we're more than 3 years after my purchase, the akshav avati many, and that's why I don't have my star anymore. I didn't feel that I had the need to continue holding on to my star. I'm here for 3 years. Father didn't say a word, the son didn't say a word, and you didn't say a word. I had no idea that you bought this property from the son. The lekech mi ben less lekala. You buying it from the son did not create a kol, and therefore will have a macha. But the problem is selling it with a star. There's piercing there. Ein loch macha gedoy lemizu. That should have been a phenomenal macha. So machra ben l'soiv shtei shanim l'lekeach zeh. And therefore, the moment the machzik saw after 2 years that his son sold this property to a third party, that's a great macha. He should have known, oh boy, I better hold up to my star now, because they're definitely exerting violence over here. So therefore, the Zohar B'Shtar kol hayomim ademar le'lishtar da'halokea. He would have to hold on to his star forever. That's such a massive macha. He shouldn't even hold it for 3 years. He should be holding it forever until he could prove that this lekeach star was not valid. Although the shalosh shanim achar star ain't die. The Rashbam is saying a chiddush that the Gemara doesn't say. Once it's sold, you can't even just hold it for 3 years. You have to hold it forever. Once there's a star up against his star, he needs to hold on to his star forever because he's going to have to deal with a challenge. Selling it is the greatest macha. If you remember, the case over there is that someone came up to me after I was living in my property for 6 years, and he shows that he had a star that he bought it 3 years ago. So there he had bought the property. He had a star on the property within 3 years of me originally moving in. Therefore, my chazaka was never a good chazaka because that sale counts as a macha. The Gemara said, unless I can show that I had a chazaka, I'm here for 7 years, meaning I had it for 4 years by the time you bought it, then it'll be mine because before you bought it, I had already had a chazaka. But the sale of a property is in and of itself a massive macha. So Zog to Gemara, if you hold like Rav, Why do we say here that it's a good chazaka? Amar Papa, Kitanya hi b'moicher sedoisov stam. If there's a specific sale of this specific property, we would all agree, ein loch macha gedolim mizu. But here what happened is the son, in one big lot, sold everything that his father owned, not specifying this field. There it wouldn't make a coil on this particular field. And therefore I do have a chazaka because I could claim honestly that I never heard that this property was sold. Let's see what the Rashbam says. Amar Papa, lo olam ein malach, l'lekech is lekal. Surely, if a property is sold, ein lach macha gedolim mizu. V'hacha ma'ilech chosvi ma'akcha l'kichas l'kech min aben. You know why that's not a macha when the lekech bought it from the ben? Mishum the macha lo yaben kol sadois of stam. It was one big sale of all of the assets that were part of the estate. The Lekeach claims to Kanisi, and that's why he's coming after me, because I bought this property in the lot of Paris of the entire lot of the whole estate. We tell him, now the machzor could say, when you bought a whole lot, it wasn't including this property. It wasn't specified. There was no specification on your purchase that specifically itemized this property. And therefore, I can make a claim as a machzor. I'm here for 3 years already. You haven't said a word to me even since you bought it for a year, that this was never included in the deal. Avo in mochar. Let me just have a look at you. Bach. Avo in mochar zu hasoda. But if this soda was specified, bifnei atzmai, then that sale is in fact a great macha and botla cheskosoi shel machzor. The einlach macha gedolim mizu. Selling a property with advertisement and fanfare, that is a great macha. Okay, the Rashbam brings a different shot that he doesn't want. Okay, let's see the Mishnah. This Mishnah sort of transitions and talks about the chazaka of raya that we've been discussing until now, and then it sort of transitions in to chazaka of how you're koina property. Let's see what the Mishnah says. If you do work in somebody's property, so you're there for 3 years, but you're not there because you own it, you're there because you're servicing it. Or vashutrim, if there are two shutrim that work on a property together, the recent, or if you're a sharecropper, so you're operating the field even though it's not yours, the apotropin, or if you're an apotropis, you're taking care of it for an estate, ein lahem chazaka, there would be no chazaka at all, because the original owner could say you weren't there because you were owning it, you were there because of your responsibilities. Let's see the Rashbam. So I was wrong as how I translated umnin. Umnin is not something that refers to people working on property. It means a dry cleaner. If I have your beged in my shop, that's not a chazaka, because it's normal that people give things to dry cleaners, and most of the items that the dry cleaners have don't belong to them. It belongs to their customers. Kagoin Savoyin, if they're dyers, like koifsin, or washers, or chayatin, or tailors, I guess the customer would provide the fabric. Oisar kebegadim, or those who used to comb begadim. What if one of these umnin shetoyanin lakucha b'yadi? They claim, I bought this, it's mine. So ein lam chazaka, v'loy becheska shalosh shanim. We're not talking about a chazaka of 3 years. We're not talking about a dry cleaner who has your shirt for 3 years. The stam umen lo shayach ela b'metaltlin. Umen usually refers to metaltlin. V'cheska shalosh shanim lo nemer ela b'mekarki. This that you need to hold something for 3 years to be considered a muchzik, that applies only to karka. Aval b'metaltli, mishu muchzik b'shel chaverei afilu sha'achas. Once it's in your hand, we see that it was in your hands. Even though this man might bring edim that says this object that's in your hand, it was mine. Neman zeh muksuk lemer lekucha b'yadi. The person who's holding on to the person who's the current muksuk can say, yeah, it was yours 5 minutes ago, but I bought it from you. Now it's mine. The stam lokeach metalta mechaveir below edim who kaina below star. Normally, when you're buying something from somebody, you're buying a shirt, you don't have an edim, you don't have a star. Put midvarim hasuim lahashvul lahaskir. The only items that we say there is no chazaka on are things that just because they're in your hand, it doesn't really prove that they belong to you. Because there are things that you normally lend out or rent out. So there's a very good explanation as to why this could be in your hand, other than the fact that you bought it. We also learn Gaidrish Einlam Chazaka. Why? Because it's normal for animals to wander, young animals, small animals, to wander. So it's a muchzik is only a right that it's yours if normally you wouldn't find somebody else's property in your hands. Okay, the same principle should apply to umnin. Even if it's your shirt that you normally would not lend out to an umin, it still wouldn't be a chazaka. But it is the norm to send this to an umin from time to time. There ain't loy chazaka litain lekuach b'yadi. The dry cleaner can't say that I bought this shirt off my client. There are edim to testify that this shirt once belonged to the customer, and the customer claims that you're holding it, dry cleaner. You're not holding it because I sold it to you. You're holding it because I gave it in to be pressed. So that's what umnin. But shutfin is talking about 3 years. Shutfin, shalachchu karka b'shutfis. 2 people bought a property in partnership. The hichzik echad b'chelik kaverin, and one of the 2 shutfin made a chazaka in the half that would have belonged to his friends. The ochal kola peiros shalashon, and what he did is he ate the pears of the entire field for 3 years. So you might think that would be a chazaka. Zokt our Mishnah ain't a chazaka. It's not a chazaka. Why? It's normal for shutfin where one, instead of splitting it, instead of doing a split of the land, it'll be timeshare. So therefore, one shutfin would have it for 3 years. Okay, gewaltig. Ha'arisin, an aris is someone who's there and he's getting a chelik of the land. But sometimes the Rashbam says that the arrangement I make with the aris is for the first 4 years you can have everything, and for the second 4 years I get everything. So that's also an arrangement that's normal, that's typical, which would then neutralize any potential chazak. Let's go back to him. I'm running out of time, so I can't learn all the Rashbams. We know a husband has nichsim aluk. He uses the nichsim aluk of his wife, so he's operating the field. He will not ever be able to say, I purchased this for my wife. Because it's normal for her to be using her husband's things. Because these are all normal things. And here's where the Mishnah transitions. Up until now, we're discussing Chazaka Shalosh Shanim of Raya. But now we're going to transition to a kinyan. If you're giving somebody a gift, or 2 brothers that are splitting up an estate, or the halach is a ger who dies is nechasim or hefker because he has no yorshim. So the first person who can make a kinyan on it, it will become theirs. How do you make a kinyan? Noal the godar. If you close the door, you lock the door, or if you built a little fence, or parts if you broke open the fence, kolshu harezu chazaka. That's a manifestation of ownership. Lagabi being koined. Okay, gewaltig. So those are the 2 halachas that we discussed. The chazak of Raya, the beginning, and then we transition to the chazak of Kinyan later. Zok the Heilige Gemara. Avu de Shmuel the Levi. The father of Shmuel and Levi, Tanu, when they were goyers our Mishnah, they were goyers shutif ein le chazaka the kol shekein un. So Zok Prishbam, shutif vabatruptin. That's how they read our Mishnah. Avol umen lo tanu. In our Mishnah, it says umen as well. In their version of the Mishnah, it didn't even say umen. You know why? The kol shekein ein chazaka. Sure, a numen doesn't have a chazaka. The ha'ein lo chelek klal. A shutif or not, or a shutuf has a chelik in this land. An omen has no claim on this land at all. So the ein chelik klal, the name of migui, the hayeloi chelik ba, kadam echaveres chelchik. It's logical that if we own a property b'shutfis, one partner might buy out the other partner. But by an omen, that would never happen. Elevadai lesakna nitin. So Shmuel and Levi said no need to say omen. If a shutuf doesn't have a chazaka, surely an omen does. Shmuel, Tani omen ein lechazaka, avo shutuf yesh lechazaka. So they both agree that it's harder for an omen to have a chazaka than a shutuf, but because of that, in fact, Shmuel says a shutuf could do a chazaka. If my partner didn't sell me his chelik, why was I here on my own? You should have been here with me. Shmuel is sticking to his shita where he said elsewhere, the Amar Shmuel, Hashutvin machsikin zelze, umeidin zelze. Shutvin could make a chazaka one on the other, and they can say edus one on the other. The nasin shomer sachar ze loze, and they can also be shomer sachar ze loze. And we'll see what this means. They also automatically are shomer sachar ze loze. So it's Shmuel Tamei because he holds that in fact a shutiv does have chazaka. That's Shmuel shita. Me'idin zelza, the Rashbam says, Me'idin zeh al chelko shel zeh lamida b'yodeh. I would be believed to say edus regarding my partner's position. Why would my edus be needed? In bo echad min the shuk la'aralov. If someone from the shuk claims that he bought or he owns prior to us, he owns my shutiv's half of the property. I'm neman to say his edus v'lo have a nogeh be'edus. We don't consider me nogeh be'edus. And what does it mean v'nashin shomer sachar ze lozeh? That's im mi beis echad mehem nignav dover shel shutivs. Let's say we owned a lawnmower or a snowblower with shutfis, and when it was by my house, it got stolen out of my garage. So do I have to pay my shutf in this lawnmower? I would be mechuyev unless it was anointed, because I'm a shomer sachar. How am I being paid to watch it? I'm being paid v'zeu schoroi to gam chaveira yishmor akoil kishirzman shemishamer za'achshav. If it's in my garage for a week, next week it'll be in your garage, and there you'll be a shomer sachar. So we're helping each other. That's why we each have a din of a shomer sachar. Okay, so now we have our Shmuel who says that shutfim have chazaka, and we have Avu the Shmuel and Levi who holds that shutfim don't have chazaka. Rami le Rab Abba le Rab Yehuda b'matzarta devei Rav Zakkai. In the oil press of Rav Zakkai, I believe the Bach changes it to matzarta. Okay. Mi Omar Shmuel shutef yesh le chazaka. Did Shmuel actually say that one shutef on his friend has a chazaka? Mi Omar Shmuel shutef kiyarid b'shustami. Shmuel didn't directly address chazaka or not chazaka in this quote where we're quoting him, but Shmuel said shutef kiyarid b'shustami. The Gemara at the end is going to say Shmuel wasn't even referring to chazaka; he was referring to something else. But right now, if Shmuel says shutef is kiyarid b'shus, lav lememor the shutef ein chazaka, doesn't he mean to say when he said shutef kiyarid b'shus, and therefore it wouldn't be a chazaka because a shutef always has business in his friend's property, as the Rashbam says, lav lememor the shutef ein chazaka davakal aris kiyarid b'shus. He has business being there, so him being there doesn't show ownership. L'kach li'ave chazaka chazaka. Dr. Gemara, look at you. No, not at all. Sometimes a shutef being in your property is a good chazaka, and sometimes it's not a good chazaka. It all depends on what our arrangement was. Sometimes the arrangement would be that I operate the field fully for 3 years, and then you operate the field fully for 3 years. And sometimes what we do is I get this half of the field for 3 years, while you get the other half of the field for 3 years. And then after 3 years, we swap so that we each have a chance to use the different parts of the field. So therefore, it'll be completely equal. Zok to Gemara, Amri lo lahagisa, v'amri lo lahagisa. Which one is less likely or more likely to be a chazaka? That's up for discussion. So there's two ways to look at this. So let's have a look at the Rashba. Amri lo lahagis. Yesh, so I'm like 4 lines down from the bottom of the wider lines. Yesh mitarotzim be'inyan zeh. There are those who look at it this way. Hadar Shmuel shutav yesh lechazaka. Under what terms did Shmuel say that a shutav has a chazaka? Is the nachas l'kula. As if he was operating the entire property for 3 years, which is not the norm, and that's why that would be a chazaka. Because the norm is the midik shutvim, little shutvis, peiris, kol shana v'shana. Every shutuf will always take some peiris from this field every single year. But the way they would split it up to make it fair is oize yitel chatzi akarka v'zeh chatzi l'shana ba l'mafreya mashalokach zeh ishtakid yikach zeh achsav. So if there's part A of the field and part B of the field, the first year you get A, I get B. The second year you get B, I get A. But every year I'm taking from pairs. So therefore, everybody wants to benefit from his part of the property every single year. Therefore, what you did was out of the norm. Now that we did something unusual, and you're going to have full use of the property for 3 years, that would require a macha. If not, the assumption is that vaday macha lo yischal. The hill have a chazak. The hadam of Shmuel ain't like chazaka. And when Shmuel said that shutfim don't have a chazaka, or he didn't really say shutfim don't have a chazaka, he said it's kiyard b'shus. It's the nachas lepal. We did exactly that. Shekein derech shutfim lechel zeh palga v'dich chavrei palga shalosh shanim hayabra. And then they flip it around. So if we did what the normal thing that normal shutfim do, then that's not a chazaka. If we do something different, then it's a chazaka. And those who look at exactly the opposite. There will have a chazaka. If you had it fully for 3 years, that's not the norm. That's why it would be that's why it would not be a chazaka. But that is the norm. If you took the property fully for 3 years, that would be the norm. So it's funny, there's a difference of opinion as to what the norm was. Maybe in different cities they did things differently. I can't say that I bought it. But if I take half of the property for 3 years, then it's a chazaka. It's mistaber to say that it's his chelik. The im isa, the nichalei hanois mechalkai, the cholshana v'shana, if you want to say that I didn't want to do the norm, that I have the property fully for 3 years and you have the property for 3 years, rather every year I take one side of the field, they shouldn't have split it up this way. They should have operated the whole field together and split the pairs, but not me taking one half and you take the other half, because that is not the norm and that would be a chazak. So either way, we could make a distinction. Sometimes there would be a good chazak, or sometimes there wouldn't be, because of what the norm was, and this is out of the norm. Zok to Gemara, Ravina Omar. No, we don't have to make such a distinction. In Shmuel, we could say havaha the nachas lokut. In both cases, the mechazik, the one who was the machzik, was taking all of the payers fully for 3 years. V'loy kasha, it's still not fair. Ha de ispa din chaluka, ha de lespa din chaluka. It depends on how big the property was. If it was a property that would normally have been split because there was enough for each one to have 4 amas, well, then by me exerting ownership on all the properties, a riot. But if it was a type of property that they couldn't possibly split because it was too small, well, then me being in the whole property would not be a chazaka. Guba zaktimor. Shmuel Amar Shmuel Shutev Kiyarid B'Shustav. Correct Gemara. My Kamash Malon. Based on what we said until now, what Shmuel was trying to express was that Shutvis ain't like chazak. Right? Tintas Kiyarid B'Shustav, there's no chazak. So why is Shmuel beating around the bush? Let him just come out right and say, Lema Shutav ain't like chazak. Why did he express it in a cryptic fashion by saying Shutav Kiyarid B'Shus? Elamai, it must be that Shmuel was not even talking about chazak. Shmuel must have been referring to something completely different. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi Bava, Loimer shenoitel b'shvach hamagia l'ksafim b'sada she'eino su'alita kesada su'alita. What would happen if we're shutfim and this field was supposed to be planted with wheat, and I went and planted trees that shouldn't have been there? If I go into your property and I do that, then I get the lesser of the two, the shvach or the yitzia. But here, since I'm a shutaf here, I would have a right to collect half of the full produce of this field, even if it's much greater than the Yitzhak. So that just means shurtus, because Yord B'Shus, we don't look at it like, since I planted something that shouldn't have been planted there, it's as if I was Yord or No, we look at it as if I did it B'Shus, and therefore I'm entitled to half of the profit from this planting. Okay, we'll stop here, Rez Hashem, and we'll be on tomorrow. I'll have to give up on my OCD of getting onto the Amud Aleph today.